My boss promised me a promotion, but gave it to his nephew instead. Then I found the emails. I felt my heart drop into my stomach when I saw the email announcing the promotion. It was supposed to be mine. After years of hard work and late nights, my boss had promised me the position. But there was a congratulatory message directed at his nephew, a guy who had barely passed his last project review. As I stared at the screen, disbelief turned to anger. How could he do this to me? I had trusted him, believed in the integrity of our workplace. I felt a mix of betrayal and humiliation wash over me, and I knew I needed to find out more about this underhanded move. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my mind racing with questions. I overheard my boss chatting with someone in the break room, their voices low and conspiratorial. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. There was something shady happening, and I was determined to uncover it. When I returned to my desk, I opened the project performance reports from the last quarter. I had meticulously tracked every detail, ensuring our team was on point. The more I read, the more I realized how much my contributions had been overlooked. I had led the most successful projects, yet here I was, sidelined for a family connection. After work, I called my best friend Sarah, who also worked in the company. I needed to vent, to make sense of the chaos swirling in my head. As I recounted the day's events, her silence spoke volumes. She was just as shocked as I was, but there was a hint of concern in her voice. "You need to be careful," she warned. "This could get messy." I hung up feeling more isolated than ever. I needed proof, something concrete to back up my suspicions. If my boss was willing to sacrifice my career for his nephew, who else was involved? I decided I would dig deeper, no matter the risk. The next day, I stayed late at the office, poring over emails and reports. I wanted to find anything that would suggest favoritism or collusion. I stumbled upon an email chain between my boss and a higher executive discussing the promotion timeline. My heart raced as I read through their casual mentions of family ties and strategic placements. Each click of my mouse felt like a step deeper into a rabbit hole. I saved the emails, my hands shaking slightly as I did. This was it. This was the evidence I needed to confront my boss. But even as I gathered the information, doubt gnawed at me. Would anyone believe me? Would it matter? Later that week, I met with Sarah again, sharing my findings. She leaned in, her brow furrowed. "This is serious," she said, "but you have to be cautious. If you go up against him, it could backfire." Her words hung heavy in the air, and I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me. Despite her warnings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to act. The idea of letting this go, of letting him win, was unbearable. I decided to gather more evidence, to be as thorough as possible before making any move. I started to observe my boss's interactions with his nephew, looking for anything that could help my case. Days turned into weeks, and my investigation began to feel like a full-time job. I found inconsistencies in the nephew's project reports, glaring mistakes that had somehow gone unnoticed. I started to connect the dots, realizing that this was not just about me anymore. It was about the integrity of our entire team. But the more I dug, the more I felt the tension in the office. My boss seemed to be watching me, his eyes lingering a little too long whenever we crossed paths. I could sense that he was suspicious, and that only fueled my determination to expose the truth. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between my boss and the higher executive in the conference room. They were discussing upcoming projects, but the undertones of their dialogue hinted at something more sinister. Words like control and influence slipped through the cracks, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to confront my boss soon, but the thought terrified me. What if he dismissed my claims? What if he retaliated? My mind was a whirlwind of fear and resolve, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something big. As I left the office that day, I glanced back at the building, the weight of my findings heavy on my shoulders. I was walking a tightrope, and one misstep could lead to a fall. But I had come too far to turn back now. I needed to see this through. The next morning, I woke up feeling a mix of determination and dread. I had the evidence I needed, but what would happen next? As I sat at my kitchen table, sipping my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head. The world of corporate politics was murky, and I was just a pawn caught in a game I didn't fully understand. Arriving at the office, the atmosphere felt different. My colleagues exchanged glances, whispers fading as I walked by. I could sense the tension, the undercurrent of gossip that had likely spread after my overheard conversation. It was as if I'd stepped into a minefield, every step potentially triggering an explosion of scrutiny. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept racing. I glanced at my inbox, where an email from my boss awaited. The subject line read, Project Update. My heart sank. Was he going to brush me off again? I opened it cautiously, and the message was curt, barely acknowledging my contributions. It felt like a deliberate slight, another reminder of my place in his hierarchy. Throughout the day, I noticed my boss's nephew lingering near my desk, an awkward smile plastered on his face. He was usually oblivious, but today he seemed unnervingly aware of my presence. I caught him glancing at my computer screen, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of indignation. Was he trying to intimidate me, or was it something more sinister? During lunch, I sat with a couple of colleagues, trying to act casual while my mind was racing. One of them, Sarah, seemed particularly interested in my mood. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. I hesitated, weighing the risk of confiding in her. But I needed someone on my side, someone who could help me navigate this treacherous landscape. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "I think something shady is going on with the promotion process. I have some evidence." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I feared I'd gone too far. But then she nodded slowly, as if processing my words. "I've heard rumors too. I can help you gather more information if you want." Relief washed over me, but I also felt the weight of a growing burden. This wasn't just my fight anymore. As we spoke, I noticed my boss approaching, a frown etched on his face. "What's this about rumors?" he interjected, his tone icy. I felt a rush of panic, but Sarah quickly changed the subject, redirecting his attention. I could see the flicker of suspicion in his eyes, and it sent a chill down my spine. I was being watched. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my mind a whirlwind of possibilities. I spent hours digging through project performance reports, trying to find discrepancies that could back up my claims. Each document I opened felt like a Pandora's box, revealing inconsistencies that made my blood boil. The nepotism was more blatant than I had imagined, and it only fueled my resolve. By the time I left the office, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I felt the weight of my discoveries pressing down on me. As I drove home, my thoughts were consumed with the idea of confronting my boss. But what if he retaliated? What if he had the power to make my life miserable? The stakes felt higher than ever. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the day's events over and over, each detail sharpening my resolve. But doubt crept in, whispering that I was just a woman against a system designed to protect the powerful. I had to remind myself why I was doing this. Not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been sidelined because of favoritism. The following morning, I decided to dig deeper. I called Sarah and asked if she could help me connect the dots. "I think we need to gather more evidence, maybe even talk to some other colleagues," I said, my voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. She agreed, and we set a plan to discreetly gather intel, knowing we had to tread carefully. In the days that followed, I noticed more inconsistencies. Emails that hinted at secret meetings between my boss and the higher executive began to surface, and I felt the puzzle pieces slowly coming together. Each revelation felt like a small victory, but it also heightened my anxiety. The closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. One afternoon, I overheard my boss on a call in his office, his voice low and conspiratorial. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. He was discussing the promotion, and I felt my heart race as I leaned closer to the door. My instincts screamed that I was on the verge of uncovering something monumental, but I had to be careful. One wrong move could expose my investigation. As I returned to my desk, I noticed the boss's nephew watching me again, his expression inscrutable. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Was he aware of my digging? Did he know that I was onto them? I couldn't let him intimidate me. I had to remain focused on the end goal. But the stakes were rising, and I was acutely aware of the danger I was in. With Sarah's help, I compiled a dossier of everything I'd found. Each piece of evidence felt like a stepping stone toward justice, but I also felt the weight of the risks involved. I had to confront my boss soon, but the thought made my stomach churn. What if he turned the tables on me? What if he threatened my job again? But I couldn't back down now. I had come too far. The morning after my confrontation with my boss, a sense of urgency surged through me. I knew I had to act quickly. The more time that passed, the easier it would be for him to cover his tracks. I spent the entire day in a haze, my mind racing with thoughts of how to gather more evidence. Every time I heard my boss's voice echoing through the office, a chill ran down my spine, reminding me of the stakes at play. Sarah was my lifeline, and I needed her support more than ever. We met during lunch at a small cafe around the corner, the kind of place where the chatter of other patrons could drown out our whispered discussions. I laid out my plan to gather more concrete evidence, mentioning the emails I had discovered. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with concern, but I could see the determination flickering behind them. She was all in, and I felt a rush of gratitude for her unwavering support. We decided to focus on the project performance reports, the ones that showcased the success of my team compared to the underqualified Nephews. If I could demonstrate that my work had consistently outshone his, it would add weight to my claims. We spent hours poring over data, comparing metrics and outcomes, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping as we uncovered discrepancies that highlighted the favoritism at play. Each finding felt like a small victory, a step closer to exposing the truth. As the days passed, I became more adept at navigating the office landscape. I learned to observe my boss's interactions with his nephew, looking for any signs of collusion or manipulation. It was subtle at first, small nods and whispers exchanged during meetings. But I began to connect the dots, realizing that my boss was not just protecting his nephew. He was actively undermining my efforts. I could feel the tension building inside me, a mix of frustration and resolve. This was no longer just about my promotion. It was about integrity. One afternoon, while waiting for a meeting to start, I overheard a conversation between my boss and a higher executive. They were discussing the upcoming quarterly review, and I couldn't help but leaning closer, my heart racing. My boss mentioned something about needing to ensure his nephew's projects were highlighted positively, while the executive seemed to agree with a nod. The implications of that brief exchange hit me like a ton of bricks. This was bigger than I had initially thought. It was a web of deceit that reached far beyond my boss's office. I quickly jotted down notes on my phone, my mind racing to process what I had just heard. This secret deal was a goldmine of evidence, but I needed to tread carefully. I couldn't risk alerting my boss or the executive to my suspicions. My heart pounded as I imagined the fallout if they discovered my investigation. I had to be strategic. I couldn't just rush in with half-baked evidence. I needed to gather more information and find a way to present it without putting myself in jeopardy. Over the next few days, I continued to dig deeper. I spoke to colleagues casually, trying to gauge their feelings about the promotion practices without revealing my intentions. Some shared their frustrations, while others seemed oblivious to the nepotism at play. It was a delicate dance, but I was determined to find allies among my peers. With Sarah's help, I compiled a list of names of those who had voiced concerns, hoping to build a coalition that could stand behind me when the time came. Late one evening, I found myself back at my desk, sifting through the company's archived emails. I stumbled upon a thread that included discussions about project allocations, and my heart raced as I read through it. My boss had explicitly mentioned his nephew's projects, praising their potential despite the glaring lack of qualifications. This was the smoking gun I needed, a clear indication that my boss was manipulating the system for his personal gain. I saved the email, my hands trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. As I sat there, piecing together the evidence, a thought struck me. What if I could leverage the data I had gathered in a way that made it impossible for them to deny the truth? I could present my findings at the next team meeting, laying everything out for everyone to see. The idea filled me with a mix of dread and exhilaration. It was risky, but if I played my cards right, it could force the company to take action against my boss's unethical behavior. The following day, I shared my plan with Sarah, and she was both thrilled and apprehensive. We discussed the potential repercussions, but I felt a sense of urgency that I couldn't shake. The longer I waited, the more entrenched my boss's actions would become. I began drafting a presentation, carefully organizing the evidence to create a compelling narrative. I wanted to ensure that no one could twist my words or misinterpret the data. This was my moment to shine, and I couldn't afford to falter. With each slide I created, I felt a surge of empowerment. I was no longer just a victim of workplace sabotage. I was a force to be reckoned with. I imagined the looks on my colleagues' faces as I unveiled the truth, the shock and disbelief that would ripple through the room. But alongside that excitement was a gnawing fear. What if my boss retaliated? What if my career was at stake? I had to push those thoughts aside. This was bigger than me. As the day of the meeting approached, I found myself second-guessing my resolve. Would anyone believe me? Would they stand by my side? I decided to reach out to a few trusted colleagues, discreetly sharing snippets of my findings. Their support bolstered my confidence, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the integrity of our workplace and the values we all stood for. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early, my heart racing with anticipation. I set up my laptop, rehearsing my presentation in my mind. I could already hear the murmur of voices as my colleagues filed in, each one unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. When my boss entered the room, I felt a surge of adrenaline. He had no idea what I had planned, and I was determined to catch him off guard. This was my chance to expose the truth and reclaim my rightful place. As I stood before my colleagues, ready to present my evidence, I took a deep breath. I could feel the weight of their gazes on me, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. I was about to take the biggest risk of my career, and I had no idea how it would all unfold. But I couldn't back down now. I had fought too hard to let this moment slip away. The room buzzed with murmurs as I wrapped up my presentation. I could see a mix of disbelief and concern etched on the faces of my colleagues, and I felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. My heart raced as I caught sight of my boss, his expression a tight mask of anger and fear. It was clear that the carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, and I was determined to push through the cracks and expose the truth. After the meeting, I was met with a whirlwind of reactions. Some colleagues approached me, their eyes wide with admiration and support, while others whispered behind my back, their faces a mix of uncertainty and fear. I could sense the tension in the air. The atmosphere had shifted, and the stakes were higher than ever. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had felt the sting of my boss's nepotism, but had been too afraid to speak up. As I made my way back to my desk, I noticed my colleague Sarah lingering by the coffee machine. She had been one of the few to openly support me during the meeting, and I sensed that she had more to share. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. I nodded, and we slipped into a nearby conference room, closing the door behind us. Sarah's eyes were wide, and I could see the anxiety in her expression. "I overheard something last week that might help you," she said, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in. She took a deep breath and continued, "I was in the break room when I heard your boss talking to the higher executive about the promotion. They were discussing how to keep things under wraps, how to make sure nobody questioned the decision. It sounded like a deal was struck to protect his nephew's position." My stomach churned at her words. The implications were staggering. If there was a deal between my boss and the higher executive, it meant this wasn't just about nepotism. It was about a systemic problem that ran deep within the company. I had to find out more. "Did you hear anything specific?" I pressed, my mind racing with the possibilities of what this could mean for my case. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "They mentioned something about needing to ensure smooth sailing for the nephew's project and how they could manipulate the performance metrics to make it look like he was exceeding expectations. It was all very calculated." I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the kind of evidence I needed to solidify my claims, but it was also a dangerous game we were playing. The walls were closing in, and I had to tread carefully. After our conversation, I spent the next few days gathering more information. I revisited the project performance reports, looking for discrepancies that could support Sarah's claims. The more I dug, the more I found. Metrics had been altered, timelines adjusted, and feedback selectively curated. It was like peeling back layers of a rotten onion, and each layer revealed a deeper level of corruption. But with each discovery came a new layer of pressure. I could feel the eyes of my boss on me more than ever, his gaze a constant reminder of the risk I was taking. During team meetings, he seemed to scrutinize my contributions, as if he were waiting for me to slip up. I started to feel isolated, a lone wolf surrounded by a pack that was either too afraid or too complicit to stand with me. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I overheard my boss speaking with the higher executive in a hushed tone. I paused, hidden around the corner, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. Words like damage control and reputation floated through the air, and I realized they were discussing the fallout from my presentation. My heart raced. They were scared, and that fear gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt before. I decided it was time to take the next step. I reached out to a former colleague who had moved to another company but had experience in HR policy. I needed to understand the implications of what I had uncovered and how to present it effectively. Our conversation was enlightening. She advised me on how to document everything and prepare for a formal complaint. It was a strategic move, but I felt the weight of each step as I ventured deeper into the corporate minefield. The next day, I meticulously organized my findings, compiling emails, performance reports, and witness statements. I felt a sense of urgency. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this was bigger than just my promotion. It was about creating a fair workplace for everyone. But with each piece of evidence, the risk of retaliation loomed larger. My boss was cornered, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. As I prepared for the next phase of my plan, I noticed a change in the office dynamics. Colleagues who had once avoided me began to approach with cautious curiosity. It was as if the veil had been lifted, and they were beginning to see the truth. I felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. Could I really rally enough support to confront the systemic issues at play? Or would I be left standing alone, fighting against a tide of complacency? With the stakes rising, I decided to take a calculated risk. I reached out to a trusted mentor within the company, someone I believed would understand the gravity of the situation. Over coffee, I laid out my findings, careful to gauge their reaction. To my relief, they listened intently, nodding as I spoke. "You have to take this to HR, but be prepared for pushback," they warned. Their words echoed in my mind as I left, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on my shoulders. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, papers strewn across the surface, and I felt the exhaustion of the past weeks settle in. I was in uncharted territory, but I was also more determined than ever. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I had to push forward. I began drafting a formal complaint, detailing everything I had uncovered, ready to present it to HR. But even as I typed, a nagging thought tugged at me. What if I was stepping into a trap? The next morning, I walked into the office with a sense of purpose. I had made my decision, and I was ready to face whatever came next. As I approached HR, I felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration. This was it, the moment I had been building toward. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation ahead, and pushed open the door to the HR office. As I stepped into the HR office, the sterile environment felt suffocating. The walls, painted in a bland beige, seemed to close in on me, echoing the weight of my decision. I was ready to unveil the truth, but uncertainty gnawed at the edges of my resolve. What if I was too late? What if my boss had already covered his tracks? The HR representative, Lisa, looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from neutral to curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone professional but warm. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my words. Should I dive straight into the allegations or ease into it? I chose the latter, trying to gauge a reaction. "I have some concerns about recent promotions in the department," I began, carefully selecting my words. "I believe there might be some unethical practices at play." Lisa's brow furrowed slightly, and I could see her interest peaking. This was the moment I needed to seize to plant the seeds of doubt about my boss's integrity. As I detailed my findings, I could see the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. I shared the emails, the performance reports, and the conversations I had overheard. With each piece of evidence, I felt a rush of adrenaline, but I also sensed the gravity of what I was suggesting. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing a culture of favoritism that could impact many others. Lisa leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she processed the information. "This is serious," she finally said, her voice low. "Have you considered the repercussions of going public with this?" I nodded, knowing full well that I was stepping into a minefield. But what choice did I have? I couldn't let this go unchallenged. "I have to do what's right," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my stomach. "I'm willing to provide everything I have, but I need your support." The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken concerns. Lisa's gaze softened as she nodded slowly, signaling her willingness to help. I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. After our meeting, I returned to my desk, the weight of the world still heavy on my shoulders. I knew I had taken a significant step, but the battle was far from over. I needed to be strategic now. I had to find a way to gather more support without drawing too much attention. The stakes were rising, and I could feel the tension in the air, thickening like a storm cloud ready to burst. That afternoon, I reached out to a few trusted colleagues, individuals I knew had witnessed the nepotism firsthand. I carefully crafted my approach, asking open-ended questions about their experiences with the promotion process. To my relief, several shared similar concerns, recounting their own frustrations and doubts. Each conversation reinforced my belief that I wasn't alone in this fight. One colleague, Maya, was particularly vocal. "It's ridiculous that we have to work twice as hard just to be overlooked," she said, her eyes blazing with indignation. I could see the fire in her, a reflection of my own determination. Together, we brainstormed ways to collect more evidence and build a united front against our boss's manipulation. As the days passed, I felt the urgency intensifying. I started documenting everything meticulously, conversations, timelines, and any evidence that could support our claims. Each piece of information felt like a puzzle falling into place, revealing a larger picture of deceit. I was uncovering a web of manipulation that reached beyond my immediate department, and I needed to be ready to expose it. However, I also had to be cautious. I could sense that my boss was watching me closely, his demeanor shifting whenever I entered the room. He had a way of making me feel like I was under a microscope, and I had to play my cards right. Any misstep could jeopardize everything I had worked for, and I wasn't about to let that happen. During one particularly tense meeting, I caught my boss's nephew glancing at me with a mixture of guilt and fear. It was a fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes. Did he know the extent of his uncle's manipulation? Did he feel trapped in this web of deceit? My instincts told me there was more to his story, and I was determined to find out what it was. After the meeting, I approached him in the break room, my heart racing. "Can we talk?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He hesitated, glancing around as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he muttered, but I pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. "I'm not here to make trouble for you," I assured him. "I just want to understand what's really going on. We both know this isn't fair." His eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought he might open up. But then he shook his head, a shadow of conflict crossing his face. "You don't know what you're getting into," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, I felt a mix of frustration and resolve. I was inching closer to the truth, but the walls of silence were thick and the stakes were higher than ever. I had to keep pushing forward, even if it meant navigating treacherous waters. The truth was out there, and I was determined to bring it to light. I spent the next few days in a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. The chaos of the office buzzed around me, but I was locked in my own world, piecing together the evidence I had gathered. Each email, each report felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place, revealing a picture of manipulation that I couldn't ignore. But I needed to be careful. One wrong move could jeopardize everything. I decided to reach out to Jenna, my colleague who had been quietly supportive throughout this ordeal. We met in a small coffee shop around the corner from the office, where the hum of conversation provided a perfect cover for our discussion. As I sipped my latte, I could see the concern etched on her face. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, my determination stealing my resolve. Jenna had some additional insights that I hadn't considered. She shared rumors she had overheard about the higher executives' involvement in the nepotism scandal. Apparently, there had been whispers about backdoor deals and promises made that went beyond mere office politics. The more she spoke, the more I felt the weight of the truth pressing down on me, urging me to act before it slipped away. After our meeting, I returned to the office with renewed vigor. I started meticulously organizing my evidence, creating a timeline that connected the dots between my boss, his nephew, and the higher executive. I had to be ready to present my case in a way that left no room for doubt. Each day, I felt the tension in the air grow thicker, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to explode. I decided to test the waters by casually bringing up the promotion issue with a few trusted coworkers. Their reactions were telling. Some were sympathetic, while others seemed defensive. One colleague, Mark, was particularly evasive when I mentioned the nepotism rumors. It made me suspicious. What did he know? I needed to dig deeper into his involvement, but I had to tread carefully. The next day, I approached Mark in the break room, feigning casual interest. "Hey, have you heard anything about the promotion process? I feel like there's a lot we don't know," I said, watching his body language closely. He hesitated, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It's all politics, you know? Just stay out of it, and you'll be fine," he replied, his tone clipped. That only fueled my curiosity further. With each interaction, I was gathering more hidden proof, but I still needed a solid foundation to stand on. I decided to confront Jenna again, this time asking her to help me compile everything into a formal report. We spent hours in her apartment, surrounded by documents and notes, crafting a narrative that clearly outlined the manipulation and deceit. It felt empowering to finally have a tangible plan. As we worked late into the night, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I was acutely aware that I was walking a tightrope, balancing my career and integrity against the powerful forces of nepotism. But the thought of letting this injustice slide was unbearable. I had to expose the truth, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been overlooked and undervalued in the company. By the end of our session, we had created a detailed presentation that highlighted the discrepancies in the promotion process, complete with dates, names, and supporting evidence. It was a weapon, and I was ready to wield it. But as I packed up my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The stakes were rising, and I needed to act before someone else tried to silence me. The air in the conference room felt electric as I entered, my heart racing. I had arranged a meeting with a few trusted colleagues, each of whom had been quietly gathering their own evidence against our boss's corrupt practices. We were on the brink of something monumental, and yet a nagging fear crept in my mind. What if this backfired? What if we were walking into a trap? As I settled into my seat, I noticed Sarah, a fellow project manager, fidgeting with her notepad. She had been invaluable in piecing together the timeline of events, and today she seemed particularly anxious. "Are you okay?" I whispered, trying to gauge her mood. She glanced around the room, ensuring no one was listening, and nodded, but her eyes betrayed her worry. The meeting began, and we each took turns presenting our findings. I could see the tension in the room rise as we laid out the emails, performance reports, and the blatant nepotism that had plagued our department. Each slide I presented felt like a weight being lifted, yet the more we revealed, the more I sensed a looming shadow. Our boss was not going to take this lightly. As we wrapped up, I could see Sarah's hands trembling slightly. "I overheard something yesterday, something that might change everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned in closer, intrigued. "It's about the higher executive involved in the promotion. I think he's been warned about our investigation and might be planning a counterattack." My stomach dropped. We were in deeper than I had anticipated. The meeting ended, but I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. I gathered my things and stepped out into the hallway, only to find myself face to face with my boss. His expression was unreadable, but the tension was palpable. "I hope you're not getting too comfortable with your little crusade," he said, his voice low and threatening. I managed to keep my composure, but inside, I felt the walls closing in. I quickly returned to my desk, heart racing. I needed to figure out our next move, but I also needed to protect myself. The last thing I wanted was to be blindsided by an executive decision that could jeopardize everything I'd worked for. I pulled up my emails and started drafting a message to Sarah outlining our next steps when suddenly a new email notification popped up. It was from the higher executive, the very one Sarah had warned me about. The subject line read, "Regarding our recent discussions." My hand shook as I clicked it open, and my heart sank. It was a vague, yet menacing message, hinting that he was aware of our inquiries and urging me to consider the consequences of digging too deep. It felt like a direct threat, and I knew I had to tread carefully. Feeling cornered, I reached out to a few other colleagues, trying to gauge their sentiments about the recent events. To my surprise, several were willing to back me up, sharing their own experiences of feeling overlooked or undermined by our boss. It was a small glimmer of hope, but I knew I had to act fast before the tides turned against us. As the day progressed, I received a text from Sarah asking to meet after work. I felt a mix of excitement and dread. We needed to solidify our strategy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. When we met, she looked more determined than ever. "We can't let this go unchallenged. If we're going to take a stand, we need to gather every piece of evidence we can before it's too late," she urged. I nodded, realizing the urgency of our situation. We spent the next few hours compiling everything we had, creating a comprehensive dossier that included testimonials from our colleagues. Each story was a thread, weaving a larger narrative of deceit and betrayal. The more we gathered, the more emboldened I felt, but I also knew the risk of exposing ourselves was growing. As we finalized our plan, Sarah suggested we set a date for our next big presentation, one that would include not just our evidence, but also a clear demand for change. I agreed, feeling the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. We were on the brink of a showdown, and I could almost taste the victory or the defeat on the horizon. But just as I was feeling a sense of clarity, I received a call from an unknown number. My heart raced as I answered, only to hear a voice I recognized all too well. It was my boss. "I think we need to have another chat, don't you?" His tone was deceptively calm, but I could sense the menace behind it. I felt my stomach drop. This was not just a casual conversation. It was a warning. After hanging up, I turned to Sarah, my mind racing. "He knows we're onto him. We need to move fast, and we need to be smart about it. This isn't just about our jobs anymore. It's about exposing a corrupt system," I said, determination flooding my veins. The stakes had never been higher, and I knew we were on the precipice of a life-altering confrontation. As I packed up my things for the night, I felt a sense of urgency wash over me. I was ready to fight, but I also knew that the next steps would be crucial. I had to gather everyone who was willing to stand with us and prepare for the fallout. This was it. We were either going to make a change or be crushed under the weight of corporate deceit. I took a deep breath, knowing that the battle was far from over. The next morning, I arrived at the office feeling a mix of adrenaline and dread. Today was the day everything would come to a head. As I walked through the bustling hallways, I could feel the weight of my colleagues' eyes on me, some filled with support, others with uncertainty. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the stakes. This was about more than just my promotion. It was about integrity and fairness. In the conference room, I set up my laptop, my heart racing as I prepared to present the evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I could see my boss, John, seated at the front, his usual smug expression replaced by a look of guarded anticipation. I glanced over my ally, Mia, who gave me a reassuring nod. She had been my rock through this storm, and I knew I couldn't have done this without her help. Together, we were ready to unveil the truth. As the meeting began, I felt the tension crackle in the air. I started with the project performance reports, highlighting the discrepancies that had raised my suspicions. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but I pressed on, revealing the emails that detailed the secret deal he had orchestrated with the higher executive. I could see whispers rippling through the room, the atmosphere thickening with disbelief and anger. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked or undervalued. Just as I reached the climax of my presentation, John interrupted, his voice sharp and defensive. "This is absurd. You're making baseless accusations." His face was flushed, and I could see the panic behind his bravado. But I didn't falter. I turned to my colleagues, who were now fully engaged, their eyes wide with shock. "You all deserve to know the truth. This isn't just my fight, it's yours too." The room erupted into a mix of outrage and support. Mia stood up, echoing my sentiments, and soon others joined in, voicing their frustrations about the toxic culture we had all endured. John's face turned a shade paler as the tide shifted against him. It was a cathartic moment, watching my colleagues rally together, united in our demand for transparency and accountability. I felt a surge of hope amidst the chaos. As the meeting wrapped up, HR was called in to handle the situation. I could see John's composure cracking as he realized the gravity of what had just transpired. I felt a rush of adrenaline, but also a deep sense of trepidation. This was just the beginning. Mia squeezed my shoulder, her eyes reflecting both pride and concern. We had exposed the rot, but now we had to face the consequences. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the office shifted dramatically. The HR investigation into John and the higher executive began, and whispers of the scandal spread like wildfire. I felt a mix of exhilaration and anxiety as I navigated the uncertain waters. Every time I passed John in the hallway, I could feel the tension crackling between us, a silent acknowledgement of the power shift that had occurred. When the HR findings were finally announced, I braced myself for the fallout. The report confirmed everything I had revealed: nepotism, manipulation, and a toxic work environment. John was demoted, and the higher executive faced severe repercussions. The company initiated policy changes aimed at preventing future abuses, a bittersweet victory for everyone involved. I felt a sense of justice, but it was overshadowed by the emotional toll of the past weeks. Then came the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading: the offer for the promotion. It was surreal to sit in the same conference room where I had fought so hard for my voice to be heard. The new leadership team expressed their gratitude for my bravery and assured me that the company was committed to a fair workplace. I accepted, but I knew the journey wasn't over. This promotion was just a step toward rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. As I settled into my new role, I took it upon myself to foster a culture of openness and support. I wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure what I had experienced. Mia and I worked together to implement mentorship programs, encouraging transparency and communication. We held regular meetings where everyone felt safe to voice their concerns, slowly transforming the office into a place where collaboration thrived. Yet, every so often, I would catch a glimpse of John in the break room, his presence a reminder of the darkness we had emerged from. It was a complex feeling, anger mixed with pity. He had let ambition cloud his judgment, and now he was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. I had learned that the fight for integrity often came at a cost, but it was a battle worth fighting. As the weeks turned into months, I found solace in the positive changes we were making. The office environment felt lighter, and I could see my colleagues flourishing in their roles. The scars of the past were still there, but they served as reminders of the resilience we had cultivated together. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that my journey had sparked a much-needed transformation. Then, one day, as I was reviewing reports, I received an unexpected email from the higher executive who had been implicated. It was a simple message, but it carried a weight of apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I sat back, contemplating the complexities of human nature and the fine line between ambition and ethics. It reminded me that change often begins with a single act of courage, a willingness to stand up against the tide. Reflecting on my journey, I realized that the fight for fairness was ongoing. I had learned to advocate for myself and others, and I was committed to ensuring that our voices would never be silenced again. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a collective triumph that would ripple through the company for years to come. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to navigate it with integrity and purpose. In the end, I understood that the real victory lay not just in the promotion or the policy changes, but in the culture we had created. A culture where everyone felt empowered to speak up, to challenge the status quo, and to support one another. As I looked around the office, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for my colleagues, for Mia, and for the journey that had brought us all together. Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed our videos, please like, share, and subscribe to The Llama if you want more drama. It truly means a lot.